Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to John.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as many as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. Then the people saw the sign that he had done, and they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. And when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." And they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine. Amen. Please be seated. It seems a few years ago that an all-male vestry had made the decision to call its first woman priest. And in the interview process, they had somehow overlooked one of the main vestryman kind of outings during the year. It was with the rector, and nobody had really asked her about this. So the dame came for this event, which was a fishing event. And all the vestrymen showed up with their brown paper bag for lunch and their fishing gear. And the rector showed up with her lunch and her fishing gear. And when they put out into the pond, well, they had arrived at the spot of their favorite place to fish, and the rector suddenly discovered that she had left her lunch on the dock. Well, these vestrymen didn't want to lose their place in the pond, Their lines were all in the water. They really didn't want to go back and get her lunch. So the new rector stepped out of the boat, walked across the water, and picked up her lunch. And one of the vestrymen turned to another and said, "I knew we should never have hired a woman. She doesn't even know how to swim." You're supposed to be quiet. There are two different stories about Jesus walking on water in the New Testament. One's in the midst of the storm when he came walking across the water and Peter came out to meet him. And the other one's in today's gospel. A theophany, or what many people call a God event, is what Jesus walking on the water was called. And indeed it was an event of some significance, and it either declares his glory and is a further identification of just who he is, or others will say that there's a more rational explanation of the event, and he was walking on the shore or the beach. Excuse me. You see, I somehow feel the apostles never quite figured out just who Jesus was until after the Pentecost. Even though he had just fed 5,000 people from 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, it didn't sink in as to just who he was. They had seen the signs and the wonders and were awed by them. And they listened to his teaching. And they knew it was with authority. It was not like the scribes and the Pharisees. And yet they knew he was different. They knew he was something special. What they knew caused a commitment in them, enough so that when others fell away, they stayed or remained. They had seen the signs and the wonders, the feeding and the healings, the walking on water, the turning of water into wine. And yet he was something more. They knew he was special and different, but they had not sorted out what that meant, either for them or for anyone else. They were still caught up in the old idea of the Messiah. I wonder if you and I ever get caught up in old ideas in the church, so much so that we can't see the hand of God before our very faces. They were going to stay with him because they knew he was the likes of which they had never seen before. Now, many of the 5,000 were disciples, another word for learners. Some were fair weather learners or disciples. As long as the miracles happened, the healing of the sick, the feeding of people, the turning water into wine, as long as they could see or participate in signs and wonders, they would follow. Others really wanted to know him and to learn from him. But when Jesus began to teach the gospel, when he began to say that you should forgive, that you should pray for your enemies, and if someone asks for your coat, give them your shirt as well. Tough teaching. And the disciples began to thin out, and many fell away. But the 12, and here in John is the first time they are singled out as the 12, those are the ones who wanted to stay with him. Those 12, we believe, we came to call apostles, and that is those who are sent. I wonder if the apostles had known what was in store for them, if they too would have stayed or fallen away. I wonder if I would stay. Would you? No matter, they stayed, and you know their ministry. But let's go back to the feeding of the 5,000 for a minute. With whom do you identify in this story? With Jesus? Or the apostles? Or the multitude? Remember, Jesus asked, how will they provide food for the multitude following them? And Philip's response of, how can we buy bread? There are so many. And yet Andrew had a different response. There was a young lad here with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. Barley loaves are the bread of the poor, the lower classes. And when they traveled, they usually took barley loaves and pickled fish, which came out of the Sea of Galilee and were about the size of a sardine. Philip seemed to operate from a position of scarcity, and Andrew from a position of expectation. As they say, God works in mysterious ways. Parishes often do the same thing. They operate from a position of scarcity. It's rare to see them operate from a position of expectation. Seems as I think about it that I've heard several parishes, as they discuss parish business and maintenance issues, say we can't afford it. We've never done it that way. We didn't do it that way in my last parish, and I've never heard of it being done that way. Maybe Andrew was right to approach the problem from the standpoint of expectation. One never knows what God will do. The 12 didn't know what Jesus would do with the 5 barley loaves and the 2 small fishes. It seems that if you give God even the scarcity you have, He can turn it into abundance. Likewise, it seems that there are 2 kinds of prayers. One is, the Lord, fill my need. Take this pain away from me. Solve my problem. And the other kind is, Lord, what do I have that you can use? What is my talent that you can bless, multiply, and share with others? What is in my wallet that someone else may need? What do you really want to do with my life? And what ministry are you calling me to do? Some of us want to have God fill our needs, and some of us want to do what God wants of us. And maybe that's the difference between the disciple and the apostle. So who is Christ to you may not be your biggest question, but rather will you be a disciple or an apostle? What kind of a Christ follower of you? Fair weather, or do you hang in there for the long haul? One who begins with the feeling of or the idea of scarcity or expectation? A disciple or an apostle? Amen.
Amen.
Amen.